imagine the potential transformation that could take place from a multi-billion-dollar commercial expansion in the knowledge sector, no less, which is what we need the most. So, I often say, we're taking yesterday's coal miners and hopefully making them the future's data miners.
So I heard it mentioned about AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic process automation. I mean, what do we think the impact of those kinds of jobs will or can have on West Virginia?
Well, it's like data science and data analytics. It's going to be a part of every company in some form or fashion. And many might argue that it's actually part of the data science and data analytics, because AI ML is a powerful analytics tool. And you read about ChatGPT and some of this stuff that's kind of intimidating. And I think a lot of folks are getting scared about it, probably unnecessarily, in my opinion. But it's going to impact everything there is. And I think it's going to have to be part of your toolbox as an employee, just like data analytics is going to be.
Yeah. Speaker Hanshaw, from a legislative perspective, leadership perspective, at the Capitol, working with the governor, working with economic development, the Department of Commerce, and all of those things. I mean, are we positioning ourselves as a state for AI and these types of jobs?
So we have actually, excuse me, Frank, at our upcoming interim meeting of the legislature, the next time we convene, we will have sessions dedicated specifically to artificial intelligence. So our legislature is taking it up at the level of policy, but that's the level of the law, right? We also need to be cognizant of what's the level of deployment and implementation. How can state government be the customer? How can state government be the user of the service? So if you think about your own interaction with the government, one of the worst days of your life is to call a government call center, right? That everyone dreads that, to have to call a government agency and seek help. Often you're in queues of ever how many minutes or ever how many hours, so to speak. Are there technology solutions that can shorten that experience? Are there ways to deploy AI solutions to some of the most basic interactions that citizens have with the government? Because we know that most of the interactions that our constituents and our citizens have with the government are routine interactions. They're individuals seeking answers to somewhat routine, fairly rote questions. Are there better ways to provide that, more efficient ways to provide that, than staffing it with a live person who forms a queue, who causes someone to stay on hold, who then gets frustrated, who hangs up the phone, and then gets aggravated with their government? There may be better ways to solve that problem. We're trying to make sure that we're positioned adequately to capitalize on it, Frank, but oftentimes we don't know what we don't know. I used to work with a gentleman who called that a double dip of ignorance. He didn't know what he didn't know. And because of that, we're hungry for ideas and solutions when people bring them to us. Never ever think that you're being forward or inappropriate by coming to a legislator or a member of the government and offering an idea or a solution. Most of us are part-time legislators. Most of us do other things aside from serving in the government, and we welcome opportunities to learn about how we can solve problems better, how we can be more efficient at providing the services that we're charged with providing. And sometimes that might mean deploying your solutions to problems that we don't know we even have.
If I may,
yes,
real quick, I want to underscore what the speaker just said about the criticality of the public sector and the private sector to partner with innovators in the state of West Virginia. We see that persistently as a key differentiator from our startups, from our mid-stage companies, is that they can find willing, paid proofs of concept, willing partners within the state of West Virginia who seek a solution to what we would consider intractable challenges. We have individuals working in the digital health space, applying AI and ML to more effectively close that disparity gap that exists between someone who sits in an urban area and can walk into a specialist office and those who are in their home in southern West Virginia. That's a critical point, and it's one that's enabling us to motivate a lot of private capital, by the way, to come into the state against our companies because they see a willingness with partners who will help us understand and demonstrate the efficacy responsibly of these technologies to solve real large problems. And so I can't underscore enough for everyone how important that relationship has been for us to create a very effective startup state, if you will, unexpectedly so.
Yeah, I've heard it said that West Virginia, at 1.8 million generally in population, is a big enough state to have the problems of a state, but a small enough state to actually do something about it.
That's right.
And so I think what you're hearing today from our esteemed panel is that West Virginia is open for business, it's open for your ideas, and it's open to partnership. And these leaders here are working hard with many of the leaders in the audience today to diversify this economy and to be available and to be good partners. And so I hope you take that away. I mentioned earlier that this was a panel of rock stars. And so I want to, this next question goes to certainly a rock star. I want you to know that the lady sitting to my right, Sarah Biller, was just selected by the American Banker as one of the most influential women in financial technology. How about a round of applause for that? Absolutely, she's been a wonderful leader, especially in this area. So, Sarah, I'm gonna kick this over to you. Financial technology is a rapidly growing industry. What is West Virginia? And I know you work across the world, quite frankly, but what is West Virginia doing to support the development of that industry here?
Yeah, Frank, well, thank you for those comments. You know, West Virginians know how to make money. We have to remember that. But I think our origin story in the intersection of financial services and technology actually began with these gentlemen encouraging policy reform here. West Virginia was the 4th state in the country to actually introduce its own regulatory sandbox that enabled us to begin working with innovators in new and differentiated ways. So those of you who bank on your phone or pay bills or even look at new forms of credit lending, recognize that a lot of those tools have been created for a different type of individual or category. And so what we're doing is working across the innovation economy to actually bring new solutions to market that reflect the unique needs of Main Street. We're seen as leaders in building community solutions across the country, which is what that recognition really is. It's not mine, it's everybody in this room who's doing something different. So it began with policy. It began with an openness of our existing financial services system and regulators to work with innovators to develop new solutions. And then the deployment of that in a way that let us tell a new story about West Virginia, a new narrative. And for those of you who don't know it, for example, if you use Stripe, I heard this morning a little bit of concern about using Square from Karen Evans, and that is a payment rail. Stripe's another embedded payment rail. The largest amount of remote workers for that company are here in West Virginia. We have one of the most significant back and middle office development shops down in Huntington, West Virginia, building, financial pathways for financial services called Core 10. There's a lot going on in West Virginia that will help us change the trajectory of the way financial services and products are developed and provisioned for more rural economies. And I think we couldn't be prouder of these gentlemen who catalyzed that work early on.
Another trait of West Virginians is humility, but Sarah's doing great things. So.
Yeah, just to add to that, and this was Sarah's brainchild, so really, really happy to help her with it. And we've added InsurTech to the FinTech piece as well. And what that sandbox concept means is that we want to attract companies who have maybe worked in this space or maybe new thoughts to actually set up here, and they get sort of a 2-year window to validate their product and determine whether it has a path going forward before the insurance regulations or the banking regulations kick in. And so far it's been quite successful, so congratulations, Ms. Humble.
Frank, before you take the next question, this is perhaps a good time for me to say, if you are, again, a company thinking about expansion or relocation here to West Virginia, realize that we will literally change the law to make it easier for you to be here.
Yes.
That's not a joke. We do it regularly. We do it regularly. What we learn from meetings like this and from conferences like these and from speaking to entrepreneurs and folks who represent developing cutting edge industries is that very often the law lags behind the technology and the law lags behind the rest of society, and that in order to advance the way we want to see our economy advance, we have to change the law to reflect the state of society. We have to modify the provisions of law to reflect what consumers and employers and industry actually are experiencing in the real world today. It's quite common for Mike and his team to bring us examples of statutory change that we need to enact as a legislature to facilitate an investment or a job creation opportunity or an expansion here in West Virginia. We're happy to do that. We're happy to do that because, again, often we don't know that inactivity or inaction on our part has been a barrier. If no one tells us that a change is necessary, we likely will never know it. So we're quite happy to do that when we learn that there's an impediment that needs to be removed.
I've heard Speaker Hanshaw at many business roundtables say that very thing, and he'll ask, what can we do legislatively to make things better for business? So I want to pivot over to that for a minute, because this question is going to mean something to many of particularly the smaller businesses in this room, especially around Harrison and Marion County. So hub zones, or historically underutilized business zones, have recently been affected by the 2020 census. And it will impact, right now we're calculating at about $50 million in federal contracting, just in those two county areas alone. What are some of the things that the government, the state government, the legislature, economic development, and the private sector are doing to address these hub zones opportunities? Because at the end of the day, it allows West Virginia to be able to be competitive on federal contracting in a very unique way.
Yeah, it's a big one, Frank, and we want a lot more of it. We've had some conversation about that, and I appreciate that we have. As I've studied the program and as I understand it, it's less a legislative designation and more an executive branch designation. So while we will be responsive in whatever way the executive branch tells us we need to be to facilitate the development and expansion of the program in the state, the actual designations themselves, I believe, are not a legislative matter.
It is the governor's prerogative, and works through the SBA, as you know. And Graham Platts, who's the deputy, counsel for commerce, has really become somewhat of a subject matter expert on this. And so I would encourage you to reach out specifically to Graham and talk to him about it, because, and by the way, some areas can be designated as a hub zone, but it depends on, those census tracts. And so we'll have to look at specifically what's happening in Harrison, Marion County to determine whether the governor can declare it a hub zone or not.
Yeah, before I go to you, Sarah, and Jim on this, so West Virginia, to its credit, is one of the first few states to actually apply for something called the Governor Designated Covered Hub Zones, which is newer legislation, effective actually January of 2020, that allows for a state, based on census tracts, to apply for areas that may not be covered specifically under the provisions of SBA covered hubs or designated hub zones. So our governor, and through the governor's office, did apply, and we do have some governor designated covered hub zones in the state. So we're actually on the leading edge of that, which is a wonderful thing. But more needs to be done, because yes, it comes from the governor. It comes from working with, and I know we have representatives of the SBA here today, but we also need to be looking at how we can be competitive with those hub zone contracts. So Sarah and Jim, anything to add to that?
Well, I would just say, the hub zone contracting is a very important enabler of entrepreneurship, in my opinion. And quite frankly, it helps companies that aren't necessarily in the mix or the network to get in. And sometimes those get closed and it's hard to break in. So from that vantage point, they're really, really important. And quite honestly, I understand that, it's a tricky calculation with the SBA and the Labor Department and all that stuff. But really, I don't know why virtually every part of West Virginia is in a hub zone, quite honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I might just add, not knowing enough about the designation to speak intelligently. On the other side is that the capital commitments that we see coming into the state for innovative companies and ideas are so high that it warrants our kind of influence here to make sure that we don't lose every advantage that we can take to continue to see these capital commitments happen, which include Hub Zone examples. They include opportunity zones. Anywhere where there's tax harvesting to be had is really encouraging the institutional capital that are coming to innovative ideas. So I would encourage figuring it out.
Yeah, I will say that I think there's been a concerted effort to try to address this. Speaker Hanshaw, while I think there's only so much the legislature can do. I think the legislature, though, is influential and can bring these topics to bear in your individual districts. And it's important to these folks that every opportunity is had. If you think about it, we don't have large active duty bases in West Virginia.
That's right.
The defense budget isn't spent high here. So we need every opportunity and advantage that we can get. And I know the folks, this is important to the folks here. One of the things that makes this group special, and so many of you are a part of this, is the collaborative nature that we now see in our state. The legislature working with departments and private industry and nonprofits across the board. So we really are excited about the future. The future is bright. I would like to take a few minutes to entertain any questions that you might have for these great folks.
Hey, Frank, I just want to add to that last comment. Again, for 4.5 years, been on the job. And from the beginning, we said, look, we need to collaborate, cooperate, and communicate, because previously we've been competing, complaining, and criticizing. And, the former three are much more effective, and the reason we've been winning is because we're applying the former three, and we've left that latter three in our taillights.
Yes, that's right. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, for sure. Yes, sir.
So what I'm hearing is really great stuff. But one question I have for you is that one of the hardest things to do when you think in terms of West Virginia is coming out here. So have you given thoughts in terms of perhaps looking at a bigger airport and that kind of thing? Right now, closest place is Pittsburgh, right?
Well, I'll just comment that there has been a ton of hard work put in down in Clarksburg at the airport there. It is the biggest commercial runway in the state. They're getting ready to build a brand new terminal. A lot of business and industry has started to come down there. So I would say that because of that effort, we're heading in that direction.
Yeah, I want to take that. You've managed to hit my single biggest pet peeve in the state right now with that question. I'm 43 years old. I've lived in West Virginia my entire life, except for when I was away for education. And I think the single biggest missed opportunity that the state of West Virginia experienced in my lifetime was the concerted effort made by some who are no longer in positions of authority in West Virginia to quash the development of a regional airport between the Charleston and Huntington municipalities, Mike, 35 years ago now? And to paint a clear picture of how leadership has changed in West Virginia from then to now, an individual involved in that process once said, I'm trying not to give attribution, but an individual involved in that process once said that the crowning achievement of his career was the defeat of the regional airport between Charleston and Huntington to maintain the primacy of Yeager Airport in Charleston. Forgive me, but that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So we are working hard to utilize the resources we do have from a transportation perspective. I told you earlier that I'm a lawyer, and I can cite for you at least two examples over the course of the past 3 years in which my clients lost out on an investment opportunity because the bankers from New York didn't want to take a connection to get to Charleston. And to many of us, that may sound like it can't be real. It's very real. It's very real. Location matters and accessibility matters. So we have put substantial resources into air subsidy in West Virginia over the course of the past 2 years. We did just announce 5 new destinations from Jaeger, one of which is soon to be a New York destination. That's a real priority for me personally. But there's so much more to be done there. This is an area where infrastructure investment still has to be made because it's the next way we do economic development here in West Virginia. No matter, I loved what the earlier panelists had to say about the value of personal, physical presence of connectivity. I use Zoom as much as anyone here, but there is value in sitting at the table with those with whom we're trying to do business. So forgive a blunt answer, but that's the situation.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Bethany Hornbeck. I sit on the Joint Governing Board for the Health Sciences and Technology Academy. So we have a lot of experience with reaching out to underrepresented groups and also into rural areas for education to bring kids into medical fields. I'm sure you're familiar with the program. I'm curious about your all's thoughts on workforce development in the tech sector. We talked a little bit about culture in the first panel, and you mentioned earlier that, you know, the coal, the steel, the bridges, but this is a different kind of sort of educational track to go into the tech fields. And I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts on bringing folks from underrepresented populations in West Virginia into these fields, especially when we're just down the street from WVU, so a major university. Pretty easy to get to university here, but down in, you know, Tyler County, Braxton County, where there's not that kind of educational opportunity, how can we reach into those rural areas? Thanks.
Sarah, you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to begin. What we've seen increasingly, particularly at WVU, is an interest in that intersection in healthcare, business, and technology. I think Liz Vitullo is here, who chairs that program in particular. And we're levering that with our private companies that are coming in to begin to explore different and innovative ways to overcome the barriers that exist, not just in talent, but even in delivery. If you think about our capability within the typical Appalachian household to introduce in a connected approach to digital health, we're some years away from doing that, but why wouldn't we begin to think about it in terms of introducing smart, responsive electronics that are actually capable of gathering health data and providing it back and forth in a clinical setting. And so I think you'll hear from Mike and I, hopefully in just the coming days, about some work we're doing with into the private companies that are interested in helping us evolve that, which will then also pull that demand for talent forward from each area of the state. So I'm excited that you exist. I'd like to talk to you later if you'll say. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else?
Just a couple of quick comments. You know, the workforce is an issue for everyone in the state, everyone in the country, everyone in the world. And upskilling that workforce is an issue as well. We'll tell you that I'm very pleased. I'm on the Community Technical College Council, and there's some very innovative things that are going on there. The CTEs are standing back up, and I really think there's an effort in K through 12 to get to the sixth graders to say, look, there's a great opportunity for you here, to educate them about the possibilities. And so, I believe that has to happen. We can't wait until they're in high school. It just doesn't make any sense. So we've got to get to the sixth graders. And I really think there's, sort of a brilliant opportunity going forward here to train those kids to have those skills that are going to be very employable. So,
thank you. Evidenced by what you've heard today from this panel, there has been a cultural shift in West Virginia, and we see the importance of diversifying our economy, diversifying our population, and embracing the strengths that we have, while certainly valuing our history. So I think what you're seeing today is that we are open for business. We look forward to partnering with you, and we're always grateful for working together, but also for the ideas. We want those ideas, and we're starting to be, as Sarah said, we're starting to become a great state for startups, for innovation. And so I think if you have a great idea, I think you should grab one of these folks after the break. But thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your contributions to diversifying this economy and for demanding the very, very best out of this state. And thank you for being with us today.
thing, and it's through collaboration and everybody's help to be able to do this, and that's why we try to share everybody's contact information. So Frank Vitale with Forge Business Solutions, Jim Estep with the West Virginia High Tech Foundation, John Ramsey with KeyLogic, Sean Frisbee and Mary Cook from Vertex Partners. They were part of our outreach panel to get all these great panelists that we've had up here today. We couldn't do it without those folks, so thank you for helping reach out. And some of these other folks that helped with the marketing side and doing more spreading the word, they also helped us get some of these folks in. That's Gene Weaver with Stratagen, Stephanie Pethel with AST, and Shelly Montgomery. They also helped at the golf event, as did Tammy Alila from Mantech. So thank you to those folks. And then Jessica Sell also, and she's going to be one of our moderators with Rank One Computing. Jim Matuga, who is out there. If you haven't stopped by the Storymaker booth, definitely swing by that. That's a new SaaS system that his company had put out. So you're definitely going to swing by there. And last but certainly not least, Stacy Downey for helping coordinate everything here with the Marriott. So I just want to get a round of applause for all those folks. Yeah. And then also there's Blake Stewart Designs. I don't know if any of you small business, large business that's thinking about redoing your logo. If you like the Trilogy logo or if you like the background here, definitely stop out and see them. They have folks all over the country that they do designs for. They're in Vegas. They're all over the place. And again, this is about sharing the capabilities of small business. So if you like the designs, go see Blake Stewart Design. So thank you all very much.
Let's see. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me? All right, great. I'll get back to the mic. First, welcome back from lunch. Yeah, this group gets to come right after lunch, so welcome back. Hope you had a great opportunity to network with everybody that's here. My name's Andre Hicks. I am the VP and Division Manager within Mantech's Federal Civilian Sector, and we're extremely happy to be here to support the conference. Mantech has been supporting America's national security and homeland security programs for over 50 years, and we proudly serve the DoD, the intel community, space community, and other federal agencies. What we focus on is tailoring high subject matter expert capability with best-in-class technology to deliver full-spectrum cybersecurity, data collection and analytics, IT infrastructure and O&M, and combining systems and software engineering. Now, before I introduce the panel, I would like to say thank you to Trilogy. This is my first time here for this conference, and this has been great. Trilogy, thank you for driving innovation, your commitment to your community, and bringing those two things together to enable the sharing of knowledge and transfer. So I really appreciate you guys doing that. So let's introduce the panel here. They're all set up. Everyone's all mic'd up? All right. So first, Jessica, who will drive the moderation today, leading them through the gamut of questions around cybersecurity. We have Nick Anderson. Please raise your hand. There you go. He is the Cyber and National Security Executive and COO. Mr. George White. He is the Unit Chief of the FBI CJIS and Division, the CIAU. Mr. Dave Parsons is the West Virginia Cybersecurity Advisor for CISA. And Mr. Paul Puckett, the CTO for Clarity. Give them a round of applause for taking over.
Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. They picked a really lively group here to make sure everybody stays awake this afternoon. Anyway, thanks for having us. Thank you so much, Randy, Brandon, Trilogy. What a top-notch event. Can we give them another round of applause? Got Jess here. She's going to keep us on track. So everybody look at her. If we go a minute over, everybody point at Jess. I won't think you're pointing at me. But no, it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to meet these gentlemen on this panel and to moderate and go through some of these questions. I'm excited to learn with you all because I'm a little new to the tech world. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to move over to the chairs. Still good? Awesome. Okay, guys, did anybody look at the answer to the test? So if anyone listened to Karen's keynote this morning, that was fantastic because she covered all of my questions. So this is like a pop quiz this afternoon, right after lunch. We're gonna give it. So okay, let's start with you, Paul.
Okay.
Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your organization, who you are, and what you do succinctly. We'll go around the horn that way to start.
Sure. So I'm the CTO over at a company called Clarity Innovations. Clarity Innovations has been around for about 10 years. Best way to describe them is you had two operators leave the NSA and say we could build better software than what we're using. And so at the cornerstone, really, it's a software and data engineering firm that tries to apply those skill sets within the domain, predominantly within cyber operations. But that world has obviously expanded when it comes to cyber as a foundational component for how people deliver software and data for their mission. And so over the course of the last 10 years, that's grown from beyond just the intelligence community into Department of Defense, as well as federal and civilian organizations.
Wonderful. Nick?
Sure. So my name's Nick Anderson. I'm the COO for Invictus International Consulting. We're a company headquartered out of Alexandria, Virginia, that's primarily focused in the defense and intelligence space. So around about 9 years ago, there was a small group of folks that had all served the intelligence community in various facets and various capacities in their life, in and out of uniform. And they just decided, you know what, we want to build the company that we wish we always would have had as customers back when we were in the government. So Invictus was born as an idea, and we've just been growing so rapidly since then. But it's given us a fantastic opportunity, whether it's in the technology space, or the cybersecurity space, or intelligence offerings, whether it's out forward deployed at our combatant commands or at headquarters locations, to really be able to dive deep on the mission and really be able to support our customers, which is really what we're all about. And cybersecurity is definitely a key part of that, and it's something that's certainly near and dear to my heart with all the work that I've done. And I don't blame you at all for having Karen answer all the questions in advance. Karen, being one of my former bosses, had a tendency to do that to me all the time as well. So I'm 100% used to it.
Great. Dave. Uh-oh. George is going to sing for us while we wait. The song.
It's the on button. I'm just trying to be helpful.
How's that?
There we go.
Technical difficulties. Good way to start. But Dave Parsons, I'm the cybersecurity advisor, and additionally, I'm the West Virginia State Coordinator for CISA. So CISA is the newest agency within the newest department of the federal government. Came around in 2018, and 2018, the federal law pushed out the need for a state cyber coordinator. And what that does is it allows the CISA to have that outreach to the local, state, local, tribal, and territorial, the SLTT, and the local state government, and be able to have that collaboration between the federal government and state government to provide protection for the infrastructure of the United States and ensure that we have that collaboration working there.
George?
So compared to these guys, I'm more at the tactical level. So I'm a unit chief. I work for the CJIS division. The unit I manage is responsible for information assurance for all the systems that we run on behalf of our customers across the United States. So basically what we make sure is that our services and systems meet federal law, meaning that they meet all the stuff that NIST tells us we're supposed to do. So that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that they meet all the things, that the systems meet the things that we're supposed to do. And we make sure that they are practicing good hygiene, which we'll probably talk about a little bit in the questions here. So you may have, most of the folks in this room probably know this, but the CJIS division is the largest division in the FBI. And in the Department of Justice has 3 high-value assets that they have on the market that are systems. The CJIS division runs all 3 of those. And so my unit is responsible for helping the O&M teams, the development teams, make sure that we are compliant and all that kind of good stuff. So,
Well, this is going to be an exciting panel as we get ready to talk about cybersecurity, the current landscape, multi-authentication, zero trust, all of the things. So what we're going to do, I'll ask the question. If you feel particularly passionate to answer it, just throw your hand up and we'll go around the horn as we can. Sound good? So can you describe the current cybersecurity landscape and the biggest threats facing your particular organizations today? Settle down a little bit, guys. Don't.
Sure, I'll take a first swing.
Thanks, Paul.
We look at this from a few different angles. One is us internally as a company, right? We're a small business, and so trying to ensure that we've got the right cyber practices when it comes to our people, our architecture, how we provide all of our internal systems, right? That's one component. But the other being is, we're a services organization, so we support the federal government, which means that we essentially, inherit whatever mature and immature practices or architectures our customers have at the time. And then oftentimes we're brought on board to help essentially enhance their capabilities that they have. So cool, how do you actually take what is current practice, I wouldn't say best practice, but current practice that shows value in this move towards zero trust, and how do you actually integrate that into what we're doing in our architecture and our people and our processes? And so kind of looking at both kind of independently, the latter is harder. And the reason why it's harder is because everyone's at a different point in their journey and their cybersecurity kind of maturity, if you will, which means that you've got to focus on different things at different times when it comes to the customers. Similar to small businesses, and I was just talking about this with Karen as she was leaving, but like small businesses are in that kind of startup phase. They're trying to bootstrapping. People are playing a few different roles. They're trying to get it done. They're trying to grow a company. And typically the thing that they're lacking in maturity is a good architecture, is actually codified business practices that have cybersecurity in mind for how they were created in the first place, that have good governance processes for how they ensure that they're protecting their data appropriately or they're leveraging the right services to solve the problem. And so internally, coming from kind of where the company was born out of, from the NSA, I think we were fortunate enough to have that kind of like in our bones, if you will, in our DNA, and for how people, function as an organization. But we see a very different story for each one of our customers. And I think where we are sitting in this landscape, people are trying to understand what zero trust actually means and what they do to move on that journey. And the best definition I've ever heard of zero trust is continuously removing implied trust in your architecture and your ecosystem over time. And so when you look at, like, for instance, the reference architecture that came out in the 7 components, right? We've got users, applications, data, networks, devices, automation, and monitoring. We've got a lot of maturity in the network side of the house. We've always implied security through the network before. We've got, for the most good amount of maturity in devices, right? But all the other components, specifically the applications and the data, the automation, and the ability to see what's happening in real time, people are very immature in those practices. And so I think a lot of people are trying to wrestle with identifying where in their architecture they're implying trust, because historically we imply trust to data through an application, and imply trust to an application through a network, and imply trust to a network through a device, right? And so when you start to unpack those pieces and understand you've got to have explicit trust established for each, it's a lot of work, and then people struggle on what to do first. And so I think right now people are just wrestling with where to invest their time and their resources to get to zero trust, understanding the highly contentious cybersecurity posture that we live in today.
Very well said. Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. Well, I think one of the things that's interesting to me when we just consider the current cybersecurity threat landscape is, I think, a lack of ability for IT staffs to really think about consequences. It's so easy for us. So, I mean, I've been a state CISO, I've been a federal agency CIO, I've been an industry partner to those same types of organizations, and it's very, very easy for people to look at compliance requirements as the first thing that must get done. And for executive leadership, without the understanding of mission owners and without the understanding of people who can help to articulate those mission consequences, to look at compliance as cybersecurity. And that is not to denigrate compliance at all. Compliance is important. Compliance absolutely has a key role to play in securing organizations, and in particular, securing very disparate enterprises where you want to make sure everybody is kind of speaking the same language and understanding risk in the same way. But without that key context of threat and the key context of consequences and understanding what your real mission requirements are, I think it's really tough to get a good understanding of what is it that threat actors are trying to do out there in the wild, and how is it going to affect me. Being able to translate those things, INL, Idaho National Labs, has a good program that actually Karen and I were able to work with whenever we were still back at the Department of Energy, which is consequence-informed cybersecurity engineering. Their CCE practices that really get down to first starting with what are the most important things, and in particular for our industrial partners, what are the most important things that absolutely make the plant floor work, that allow you to continue to generate electricity, that allow gas to keep flowing? What are those core critical components? Now let's map out what can make that stop working. Now let's look at what the impact of those consequences would be. And a lot of times there's just that disconnect between, like I said, an IT staff and a mission owner to really be able to articulate what is it that's most important to an organization, what's most important in terms of consequences and impacts, so they can actually drive security outcomes, because the current cybersecurity threat landscape is all over the map. Ransomware kind of died off for a little while and people didn't think it was as cool. Well, now we've got MOVEit issues and ransomware's back, whether it's within state governments or federal government agencies or industry partners that are affected. It just sort of took a little bit of a lull in the action. So the landscape itself is constantly evolving, but understanding the consequences and the impact, I think, is where a lot of us have to focus some of our time.
Thank you so much. Yes, Dave.
And just to add on what Nick said, so like you said, the threat landscape is constantly changing. We have basically the playground that really is Ukraine right now with some of the Eastern European issues we're having. You have the increase in the Chinese threat with the Taiwan situation and different things of that nature. During this conference, I think I've taken 4 MOVEit phone calls. So ransomware is back and it's a thing. The issue is really going back to what he said, the critical service, and really kind of aligning that to that. And that's what the priority really should be. You should need to realize what your organization is key to it functioning, and look and compare it to the threats that are out there and what can stop that from functioning.
So I think what you've heard described so far is the landmine that is the cybersecurity landscape. I mean, there's constant threats out there, and there's constant battle to try to stay abreast of all those. At the same time, we talked about zero trust, right? And it's really funny because we spent a lot of time in the federal government creating frameworks and to meet the zero trust architectures and all that kind of stuff. But if you sort of peel back the onion on this, what you find is that what we're asking for in zero trust is really nothing that we've been asking for years in information security, which is to secure your stuff at all levels. We placed a lot of faith historically in our edge protections, our firewalls or proxies, all that kind of stuff, and we sort of ignored the application layer protections that we need to put in. And so unless you're using web services to pass traffic back and forth, most likely, the information you're passing back and forth between systems is not encrypted, as an example. And so you have to worry about those sort of things. And so, at the core level of all this is that if we look at each layer of the IT landscape and we protect ourselves in some way at each layer of the IT landscape, then we will eventually meet the zero trust. But we lose a little something in that when it comes to the identity piece of it, and that we work for a long time for federation to take place appropriately. But federation isn't the same in a zero trust architecture as it is in a non-zero trust architecture. So it's just this moving target, that you're trying to, constantly try to meet. And I know that's sort of just this, weird answer to what's the landscape look like, but it's just really just filled with landmines, and not every vulnerability, like the MOVE-IT stuff we were talking about a moment ago, depending upon where your system sat in your architecture, determined whether or not you were vulnerable to the MOVE-IT, vulnerability. I mean, the vulnerability was there, but you wouldn't be able to be exposed if you're embedded in the architecture. If you're hanging out on the web, you're fully exposed, you could get nailed. But whenever, there's this sort of outcry whenever something like this happens, MOVE-IT comes up, and it's like, oh my gosh, go protect your systems. But yes, we should have, we want to do that, but let's not fall over ourselves. Let's make sure where we sit in the architecture, make sure that we know what we're protecting and why, and whether and how exposed we are. So it's a landmine, fill a landmine. The cybersecurity arena is filled with landmines.
It's a perfect segue from the landscape to what steps can organizations take to protect themselves against cybersecurity threats, particularly those in regards to zero trust and multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, so we've hit on it a couple of times. I really think what you said a moment ago is one of the key pieces, right? You have to let the executive leadership, they need to understand why, they know cybersecurity is important. There's no doubt. Every executive leader today knows that cybersecurity is important. They just not really understand how that can fit into their business value. How can they do things from a business perspective that both meets the mission needs and at the same time protects themselves? So it's really important that you're able to articulate to the executives the things that needs to be done and why, and so they can appropriately prioritize the activities of your business lines, your different value streams, to move forward. So that's a key piece of it, because you have to be able to understand the business value in order to get the prioritization right. And so that's a key piece of it. The other one, and Brian Griffiths was up in an earlier panel today, and he talked about what we do at CJIS, what I think has sort of helped advance our calls and advance our mechanisms for securing our systems better to be more prepared for cybersecurity threats, is to start initially. Now, this is not a new idea. Every cybersecurity professional, every information security professional who's been in the business longer than 10 years or 5 years even knows that you have to start security as far left as you possibly can. And the further left you start it, then the better off you're going to be. And because we develop in an agile methodology in the SEAS division, we try to develop with a SecDevOps process. And that enables us to secure code early, to test applications that are COTS products early, to see how that fits into it. If when we're using cloud-based assets, we are able to secure those early, understand what the configurations need to be for those when we turn them on, and so that when we move from a pre-prod environment to a prod environment, we know we're good to go. So it's, in my opinion, that's sort of the key. Start left, work your way right, secure at all levels, and by the time you come to deliver your product, you'll be in a much better position.
So really, and again to add on what he said, there's nothing that really we're changing a lot with Zero Trust. The ideas of least privilege, the ideas of securing the network outside of that type of thing. So when you really look at it, why does a service account need to be able to open Word, that type of thing, restricting accounts and identities down to what they actually need to function and to keep things operational is really what we need to look at. And additionally, like at the application layers, we have this facade, and they hit on in a panel earlier that VPNs, we had to get that up. Well, one thing we're seeing is is VPN enough? Because you're really just dumping that traffic back into your network that's just unsafe. And as he said, between those services, just unencrypted. So really you're looking at, can that application encrypt itself? Can we narrow it down to that one IP address to the other side of the service and the port it requires and allow nothing else? And really limiting things down to what you really need. And really looking at the users. Additionally, deep diving what that user needs to do to function and what that device needs to do to function and taking away all other assets. It's something we've kind of gotten away from, as in you VPN back in the network and you used to have basically full game. So you can remote into different assets, hit all the services. That's something we just have to kind of get away from functionally and really hit that least privilege as hard as possible.
So this part's going to require just a little bit of audience participation. I know it's after lunch, so you're going to have to wake up for just a brief moment. Raise your hand if you have a spare tire in your car. Okay, keep your hand up. Now raise your hand if you have AAA or something like that. Okay, there's a couple more hands. Okay, now raise your hand if you have a family member or a friend that you know can fix your car if you're stranded on the side of the road, bring you a tank of gas, something like that. Okay, so there's well over 75% of the hands that are up. Thank you very much. You've engaged in resilience planning. You know that there's a possibility that you're going to hit a pothole, that it's going to be after snowplow season, and your car's going to get dinged, and you're going to be stranded on the side of the road, so you got a spare tire. You know that you've got a friend or a family member or somebody you can call for that spare tank of gas, or even just somebody you can call in an embarrassing, sort of sheepish way and say, hey, I'm stranded on the side of the road, can you come pick me up? That's resilience planning. Like you've identified potential contingencies for a failure may occur in my life in a thing that I rely on, transportation, and I created a plan around it. So when we think about key steps for securing an enterprise and engaging in cybersecurity planning, that's really all that it is. I mean, I hate to really boil it down and make it sound super simple. That's all that it is. Everybody, 10 plus, 15 plus years ago used to refer to it as, DR and COOP planning, disaster recovery continuity of operations planning on your checklist. And a lot of IT folks would look at it as backups or tape backups. And where am I going to be able to look at my hot and cold start locations? Whatever it is and whatever your organizational mission requirements are, we're just engaging in resilience planning. We have to assume at some point there's going to be an interruption. That poor squirrel is going to get fried into squirrel-barbecue up there getting on a power line, or that guy that's digging a new cable for a new fiber optic cable that's going in is going to hit and take out some existing cable, cutting off access to the data center, or that storm is going to roll through. It doesn't even have to be a nefarious cyber actor in some far-off place. Just being able to engage in the conversation around resilience and what are we going to do if, that becomes an integrated conversation between the business or the mission owner, between the IT asset owner, and between the security professional that really is kind of the core of those initial steps that you have to take to really engage in long-lasting, impactful security planning. So those are the steps, and that's exactly how I laid off the conversation, is talking about things like spare tires, because everybody understands it.
So I'm going to jump around a little bit. I love the way this conversation is kind of organically coming together.
So that said, how can organizations specifically best educate their employees on the risks of cybersecurity, particularly with phishing and social engineering attacks? Nick for the win. Squirrel BQ. You had me at Squirrel BQ.
Sorry, I'm from South Carolina. Okay, that's a delicacy. All right, don't hate. It's so I can tell you what not to do. What not to do is, if you want to see an interesting story, go Google FCPS, which is Fairfax County Public Schools, and a teacher appreciation email. So my wife's a public school teacher, and last week, even though teachers are still working this week, last week on Friday was the last day of school for students. And their IT staff has done what a lot of us have done. They've engaged in these fake phishing style campaign emails internally. If you click on it, you get sent some additional training. The IT department gets statistics. They want to see how many people reported as spam or phishing or just ignore it altogether. Well, they made the grievous mistake, and by they I mean the IT department, of sending out a phishing email on the last day of school to frenzied, harried teachers saying, Fairfax County Public Schools has partnered with a local company to give out a gift card as an appreciation for all your hard work this year.
That's wrong.
Oh, so many people clicked on it. The Washington Post got a copy of it. The superintendent had to release a message. That's a great example of what not to do. And I think that's there's a lesson there for IT staffs, that a one-size-fit-all solution of, I'm going to go to FishMe or somebody, not hating on FishMe. I've used FishMe, and like they've got good stuff too. But that's not necessarily the one-size-fits-all solution for everything to be able to educate your staff. Some of it's annual training, some of it's conversations with small groups, some of it's things like phishing exercises, campaigns, exercises. A lot of it has to be made real, though, for those individual users or employees that you're talking to. So when I was a state CISO, I spent a lot of time talking to the people that were in our financial department, the people who could approve invoices inside of the state. I personally went and spent a lot of time with them, because invoice fraud and invoice phishing was a huge thing, where we'd have somebody submit a fake invoice saying, I am business so-and-so, I'm submitting an invoice to the state. By the way, I've got updated bank information, please pay my invoice. So understanding what that threat is, understanding where your users are, and meeting them there in sort of a tailored way with automated solutions, with hands-on learning, with those one-on-one conversations, that's really where I think we have to begin with education and kind of understanding everybody's starting at a different level. Our IT staff need continuous education too. They need to continue to do professional development. That's definitely not going to be the same as me talking to a financial analyst about not approving invoices if it doesn't match up to the known good email address for a vendor.
I'd probably add, and actually I think this implies very much to small businesses, is actually having codified standard operating procedures for how things are supposed to happen, what's supposed to happen, X, Y, and Z. No different than, I know that the standard process for the IRS, if there's an issue with my return, is not to call me and ask me for my social security number, which we've all got those spam phone calls before. So let alone being able to recognize, oh, this is spam, is also understanding what is outside the norm of what is the expected process or practice. I know that the United States Postal Service is not going to send me a text message asking me to click on something to update my address. That's not what they do, but I get those messages all the time. If you have people that don't understand what the standard practice is, what the process might be, or what is acceptable, understandable, they might then fall prey to something. We're like, oh, this is something I'm supposed to do. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. Maybe this is the way they do it. And so people prey on that lack of knowledge and context of people within an organization. And so then, therefore, it's our job in order to establish what is acceptable, what is the norm, what is the process, what are the different ways. If you think something might happen, here's who you're supposed to contact, or here's where you're supposed to go. There are other mechanisms for you to validate that that is the actual thing that's supposed to be happening. So I think codifying what those practices are really important, because when you go and you look at assessments, even as part of the five-step thing that Karen talked about this morning, they're going to look at your business processes, your practices, how are you actually supposed to be doing these things? And it's great if you might have them, but what is people's actual awareness of how to actually go ahead and follow it? So I think actually having SOPs documented is really crucial, and then having them practiced across your organization is also crucial. And so that way you're starting to eliminate those entry points for people to start to get after you. No different than also training them of, just being vigilant and being aware. Probably the last thing I'd also add, and I think it's a little bit apropos to the last one of hey, what's that first step, is for them to actually understand the business that you're in and what is critical information to what you do and how to protect it. Like if you don't actually understand your assets within a company, for many it's data, right? Either your proprietary information that you've got or something along those lines. If people don't actually understand what kind of the goal truly is for your organization, right? And you also have a lack of practices, that's really, I think, a key entry point for nefarious actors to try and gain access to something. And so having both complement each other, I think, is a critical thing.
I think I'm the only double ARP member on this panel. And I think that it also gets counted in the number of years I've been doing this business. I think my first information assurance job was in 1994 at Eielson Air Force Base, Alaska. So I've been doing it for a few years, and it's funny, the conversation we have on training. How do we train people to be smarter so they won't be taken advantage of? We can't. I'm sorry, you can't. We can train everybody 100 times a week, and somebody's going to whiff on it, and they're going to hit the link, and they're going to get phished, and they're going to be beaconing stuff out. So I am always open to ideas on how, in addition to, because we do have to keep reminding people, I'm not saying just lay down and not do anything about it, but we have to figure out a way to protect ourselves in that. And I think it's just a matter of again, I keep going back to the whole layered cyber hygiene at the, up and down the row. You can't trust one thing to protect you. You have to have all these different layers. And you talk about separation of duties earlier, right? Okay, I get a general user that gets phished. The worst thing I want to have is probably some data breach, and hopefully we can isolate that, right? And then fix that. And it's never going to be a good news story, no matter what you do, no matter how you spin it. They could have lost 2 pieces of data; it's still a data breach. It just doesn't matter. So for me, it's sure continue. We need to train. We need to continue to keep people aware, keep them on their toes. That's a tough one. Sending out that email, hey, get a free thing at the last day of school. That was rough. Pretty ingenious. I'm sure that's good. But we have to keep doing that. But we can't rely on that. We just simply can't rely on that. And we have to help our customers protect themselves. And we have to help our customers by protecting themselves by making sure that our layers of security are solid, that our separation of duties make sense, that our disaster recovery is in place, that our incident response is in place, and that we've tested those. Great point. Incident, how many people do you have to, who know how to change, can come and change a tire for you? I've got my incident response plan in place in case I have a loss of a tire. I know how to do that. How often do people exercise having a flat tire on the side of the road, though, right? How often do they put that incident response plan in place? Not as often as we should. So we do things, and we do things where we have people in place. We do tabletop exercises. We plan on incident response, and very often our scenarios have to do with phished accounts. We have to plan on it's going to happen, right? It's going to happen no matter how much we train. We just have to be prepared for when it does.
So with that, talking about, the email issue, the text message issue, no one's ever going to text you and ask you for your social. Do you try to tell us a little bit about any emerging trends or technologies, good or bad, in cybersecurity? And how do you think these emerging trends impact, the posture of the security of your organization or organizations that you've referenced in this discussion?
There's probably a few that can be called out. I mean, it's to the comment earlier about moving towards agile within the FBI, right? Oftentimes when it comes to software development and delivery of capabilities, you're talking about some type of DevOps pipeline, right, where you've brought developers, IT operators, as well as independent security validation as part of a collective ecosystem in order to deliver capabilities continuously. Part of that component, and you were talking about hey, SecDevOps security is kind of like a first principle in how we design this ecosystem methodology and process, is actually having that independent check, if you will, when it comes to certain steps are happening in a certain way, certain tests are being run in a certain way in order to buy down risk of either having a vulnerability in an operational environment or a lack of resilience in your architecture and operational environment. Starting to leverage some of those components is really critical. But I think if you take a brief step back, that security scaffolding that exists to validate X, Y, or Z has been done appropriately is contextualizing what the actual mission is, what the data is, what the environment is, no different than the components of, and we've got an IA person here, just understanding the risk management framework, right? If you look at the basic components of RMF, there's categorization and selection. The way I simply describe categorization is who are you, what are you trying to do, what are you trying to do it with, and for what outcome? Because then that helps me then understand how to select appropriate controls to kind of insulate and create some scaffolding around that you've actually done all the things that you need to do when you go into your actual build and assessment in order to get an ATO. We do this constantly in our lives. We categorize risk, and then we select what we're going to do in order to mitigate that risk, and then we build towards that thing, and we actually move along our lives. The resilience of the tire scenario, right? I'm trying to get home, right? And it's important that I get home safely. So I'm going to actually assess my ecosystem around me, build some resilience into my architecture, and go and execute my way to make sure I get home safely. It's no different than how we build kind of ecosystems and components today. But where we can remove single points of failure in humans along the way is where we can find patterns for essentially reusability and therefore automation that can exist. So we can pull humans out of the loop, make them more kind of passive validators of the ecosystem rather than critical components in order to say yes. Then we're able to start to move more and more at speed. We're able to have more common architectures and designs, which then when an issue happens, it's not like we're finding a needle in a haystack. We understand the patterns that's been applied, and then we can appropriately remediate the ecosystem along the way. So I think those components are critical, but then on the counter, we're just chatting about stuff like ChatGPT, where I can say, hey, write a phishing email in my tone that sounds exactly like me, right, to my team. Here's all my past emails so you can learn from this thing. That's what essentially nefarious actors are doing. That's what bad actors are doing. They're trying to prey on essentially someone having some implied trust in me, or it clearly has to be Paul, in order to then gain entry. So we've got to, I think to your point, remove humans from the loop, right? But at the same time, we need to be able to categorize and select what we need to do kind of in order to insulate and secure ourselves, and then automate the daylights out of it, and then create some type of monitoring ecosystem over top of it to ensure that we maintain that standard.
Can I build off what Paul was talking about for a second? So I love to talk about the automation piece, right? So when Brian was up here earlier, he talked about we started moving to the cloud in 2017, 2018 was when we started kind of actively moving to the cloud, but we had started talking about that in 2014, 2015. We had cloud vendors and coming in for a while, listening and talking about it. What we found is as we moved to the cloud, the automation that we were kind of hoping to find at all aspects wasn't, there was a lot of things that you had to manually change. You had to really go through there and check that. And as we started looking at the security aspects of it, we realized that there weren't any tools available out there that we could use to do the types of checks that we wanted to use for our cloud hosts, right? Amazon, as an example, I can't think what they had. They had a cloud checker. I can't remember what the control checker. I can't even think what it was called then. They'd use something else different now. But it checked about a third of the controls that we needed to check for 853 controls, right? So we were doing 3 to 6 weeks worth of manual assessments just to get a service approved to be used, and it was killing us. So we actually went in and got our guys together and did basically a 6-week agile development effort and created, using Python, something we called the Automated Cloud Security Assessment Tool. Now that was back in 2018, 19, Brian? 19, Brian? Yeah, 19. I think it was like December 19 to January 20 or December 18 to January 19. I don't remember which one it was. But we had to develop it ourselves. Now, since then, there's plenty of tools that are out there available. But without that automation, we would be relying on humans to go in and do manual checks to make sure that the S3 bucket was actually turned to encrypt, right? Or make sure that it was not, now I think that automatically defaults to private, but it used to default to public, right? that your EC2 instances have all the different controls, put on them. No offense to AD&D, AWS folks in here, but Azure is a little bit more like they automatic when you roll something on in Azure, it's automatically encrypted. You have to turn on encryption in AWS, so you have a control to check that. But without automation, we'll be spending all of our time doing that, and it's the same for all that. And so automation is key, and that's just a piece of it, right? There's so many things that you create something automated. Say you're spinning up a Kubernetes container, right? You figure out what your controls are. You want to go ahead and understand what those are, apply the automation to it, and then do that over and over again. You don't have to worry about that being spun up incorrectly because you've used automation to make sure the first time's right, and you have your checks in there. So I think it's a huge part of it.
So one of the things that the CISA and the federal government's really pushing toward, and what reminded me is what you just said about the AWS, is the secure by default. So a lot of the things we get are inherently not.
Yeah, turned off again.
What's on?
There you go.
There you go. There you go. But the thing is, what CISA and the federal government's really pushing toward is to make sure that the industry's kind of pushing these application developers to really have things come out of the box secure, as in exactly with Azure is by default that stuff's turned on. So a lot of these things that we're having to go and do automated checks for are secure by default when they come out. Another thing that I thought about when you discuss Python is the same thing as currently we're having a big issue with memory safe software. So C++ is easy, but it's not memory safe. Statistics right now in the past 4 years, 2/3 of the incidents that CISA's had to respond to has to do with unsafe memory safe programming. So we're not really holding a lot of our application developers to the standard of using safe programming languages like Pythons, JavaScript, things of that nature, to be able to ensure that that isn't an issue. It's been a known fact that those aren't memory safe for years. For some reason, it always makes the bottom dollar work, as if it's cheaper to make something in C++, and that plugin's will be made with C++, and then we'll just leave it on the stakeholder to really take on the burden of the responsibility of it.
So can any of you discuss recent cybersecurity breaches or incidents and maybe lessons that you've learned from them? I mean, there's just a wealth of knowledge and information being shared here, and I can't help but wonder, is it because you have actually lived through some things you can share with us?
I think we all live through incidents. Everybody does. We all live. I mean, no company or no public or private sector entity is immune from incidents. Without going into any specifics, though, I think one of the things that we've learned is how vulnerable we are with our partners. I think that's a key piece that we kind of miss in the conversation, right? So the FBI is a big machine, right? And SEAS division is an equally, as it's by itself. The SEAS division is the largest division in the FBI. It's a large machine by itself. And we have tons of partners. Brian talked about 19,000 law enforcement partners out there, right? Every one of those law enforcement partners has the capability to compromise information that we host for them. Every single one, right? And I think what we found is that within federation, by having close partnerships, you share information, you build a trust relationships with them. That makes you vulnerable. It does. But you have to recognize it and accept it, right? And I think the lesson is to learn how to be prepared for the potential that risk imposes on you, and where possible to exercise disaster recovery, incident response for those sorts of things. But just as importantly, just the awareness of it. If a sheriff's department in Montana gets compromised, there is the opportunity for that compromise to directly or indirectly impact the data that we store at CJIS. Now, I'm not saying that something necessarily would happen to the division systems, but there's a relationship there and a trust, and that back and forth, can often mean that their compromise is our compromise. So that's some lessons we've learned over the last, few years as incidents have become more prevalent in the larger scales.
Well, it's like I think it was February, but it's being talked about now because some of the asks from the Black Cat kind of group has come out. Reddit was breached in February, I believe is what it was, as a phishing attack. And essentially what it was is a proxy that learned both credentials as well as second factor capability for access to Reddit's intranet. And that person happened to have access to data and information then through the intranet that the ransom group now has, and they're asking for $4.5 million and they changed one of their APIs. But even in that example, or even in some of the, because he just said it, there's an implication of trust because of the federation of services for each one of those partners, is lateral movement happens because of this assumption that you are trusted because of that kind of single point of entry into the front door. Whereas if there were certain components of, for instance, Comply to Connect from a device perspective, trying to emulate credentials of the actual device itself, apart from the actual user's credentials to the intranet, behavior, analysis and detection from certain source IPs or even time of day, trying to access certain things, pulling specific data sets that person otherwise has never pulled before. There's a number of different things that are components of a zero trust architecture that we're trying to get towards from a maturity perspective that would have called out, hey, this looks like it's a little bit of anomalous behavior, and would have been able to essentially shut that down at that point in time rather than waiting for what happened with Reddit for the person to self-report and say, hey, I think I actually was a victim of this thing, but by that time, it was too late, right? And so a lot of times we put architectures and practices in place, or even a lot of the stuff that happens from a risk management framework perspective, that more so is great in the after the fact analysis forensics of telling us how bad we were. But the point is the data's already been lost, the thing's already happened, the event's already occurred. Is our ability to be able to move with speed and detect in real time requires that we make investments in all of the components of zero trust, and not just the user side, not just the device side, not just the network side. And even beyond from an application and data perspective, really those two I see are the linchpin and cornerstone for us to truly unlock the opportunity of zero trust. And that's probably where we're the most immature, right? And so just again, recent breaches, everyone's, SolarWinds, we can keep going. We can talk about compromising the build ecosystem, right, when it comes to delivery of capability. There's a whole smorgasbord of options when it comes to people getting owned. I think everyone still then gets lost in, cool, how could it have been prevented? What could I do about it? And I think our knee-jerk reaction is to almost fall further victim into our old network security thing of oh, well, I'm going to make it so this is just a VPN only, a closed door thing. I'm not going to connect it to the internet. But what COVID taught us is remote employees, telework, there are all these different things where we can have assets of people of our organization. We can't assume everyone be on-prem, right, within our own, local network. And so trying to find the right balance between the two to have productivity and deliver capabilities, which oftentimes requires us to live in the open, right? And then countered to all the threats that come from the open, right, is a tough balance.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I do have one more question about the role of government and how private sector and government can work together. We also want to give it time for the audience to ask some questions. So maybe if one person could snag this last one, and if there's someone else that has a burning desire to add to it, please do. So with that, what do we think? How can government and private sector work together?
I think just being the agency I'm from, one of the things really we push is the collaboration. So we've stood up the JCDC Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. So really they discussed earlier, the PPD 41's really tagged us with that asset protection, and really the CISA really pushes a lot to have that integration with the private sector and the federal government, and basically bringing all that information together. So one of the things is just having that sharing threat indicators, things of that nature, sharing best practices, defense mechanisms, what worked, that kind of thing is something really CISA prides itself on, and it's one of our operations we really push toward.
So 14028, kind of came slamming down on everybody in June of 21. But it really didn't hit everybody hard until almost a year later. I mean, when people said, "Hey, we haven't implemented Executive Order 14028, we better start doing that, right? And as you guys, most folks in the room, if you don't know in the room, Executive Order 14028 was the cybersecurity, basically securing our nation's cybersecurity. I can't remember exactly everything the entire title is, but it mandated those things, and it talked about zero trust. It talks about multi-factor authentication, logging, not incident response, but IR. How do you do those sort of things? And so it has all these different pieces in it. I think that executive order actually, spurred a lot of work with industry and government together because it's a very public order, right? It made a lot of press, the zero trust aspects of it, and I think we've seen things like, these centers where we're seeing industry and government come together to work to improve those. And I think that we see it happen, all the time. Where if you have an executive order, something that comes down that all the federal agencies have to respond to, and there's 10 different pieces of it, like 14028 is close to that many. I think you find a bunch of vendors partnering together to help solve one or two of those issues. And so I think we've seen that with 14028 more than I've seen for me personally in the past, where there's been a response to an executive order in a positive way.
Okay. Any questions from the audience before we close out this very informative panel?
I think we killed them.
Did Nick turn you into Scrollbacue?
They're afraid to ask questions.
That's the word of the day.
Going once.
Nick, I think I saw that you had your hand up. Oh, wait a minute.
Here we go.
We've got
Actually, can you come up here? That way they can hear you. They can't really hear anything from here over, so.
We can barely hear Randy.
Yeah, which says that's saying something.
So Karen mentioned CMMC in her opening speech, and even though it's focused on the DoD side, I was wondering if on the federal government side, you're tracking the push to sort of finalize it, formalize it, make the entire defense industrial base use it in order to do business with the DoD.
What'd you say?
The CMMC framework?
Cyber
Oh,
maturity.
okay. CNMC. I couldn't hear your acronym. Okay.
So there's a push to it's kind of an inside joke that it's taking so long to finalize. But once it is finalized, everyone on the DoD side is going to have to do it. It solves a lot of the problems you're discussing. And I'm just wondering on the federal government side, are you guys tracking that? Do you think there's any interest in having a single framework for a cybersecurity maturity model on the federal government side?
I can tell you from the FBI's perspective, anytime DoD, like the RMF, right? Anytime that DoD puts out a framework, attention is paid to it. I'm not sure, so the Department of Justice would have to basically say, we like what DoD is doing to be fully adopted. But they often look at the FBI and ATF and BOP because of the larger size of the infrastructures compared to the rest of the components of the department to kind of look and see what they do. And really they look hard at the FBI because we're larger as far as infrastructure goes than the others. So we pay attention to any framework that the DoD does. If you look at the zero trust framework, the ZTA, the zero trust architecture that the FBI has in place today, it's very, very similar to the ZTA that got put out by DoD. And so if that becomes fully adopted by DoD, I'm absolutely certain that both DOJ and its larger components will take a hard look at it. Whether we will fully adopt it in its entire form, I don't know, maybe. It's dependent upon whether it works, right? You have to make sure that your business works. I mean, I spent 20 years in a big DoD machine, and it's a much different animal than the Department of Justice is. And so, but this certainly will be looked at. That's the FBI anyway.
I think it might be a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I think CMMC intends to address the problems, but I don't think CMMC is actually going to be capable of addressing the problems. For the same reason that the first iteration of the software bill of materials then came out and said, We want self-attestation of the software bill of materials, CMMC and your maturity practices for how well you're adopting cyber practice being a self-attestation. I think we're trying to move towards zero trust, so fairly certain that implying trust and somebody else saying that everything's okay is the antithesis of what it is that we're trying to get after, which means that things need to be validated and verified. But then if I pause for a moment and I think of a small business and their ability to say that they're securing sensitive information appropriately, their ability to monitor their ecosystem from like a CSOC perspective, there's a crazy amount of investment for small businesses trying to get off the ground. And the original assessment that came out from the first iteration of CMMC, I believe from the GAO, said essentially this is a killer of small business because the actual resources and infrastructure to meet CMMC, because part of the implication is you can't get a contract with the Department of Defense unless you actually meet the specifications of CMMC. It means that no small business ever is going to get a contract. Just recently, Rob Wiedmeyer, the Chief Software Officer of the DoD CIO, said, hey, we're looking at some ways that we can actually provide services to small businesses to meet some of the implications of CMMC simply because the barrier to entry would be too high. So no doubt everyone needs to invest in, like we've been talking about for this last hour, good cybersecurity practices, people internal to the company that actually understand what they're doing, good infrastructure and resource investment, that you're not using some Chinese-based cloud in order to secure your company information. That'd probably be a good first move. But those are resources and investments that not a lot of small businesses have to make. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of gnashing of teeth in order to truly bring the intent of CMMC, which is outstanding, to fruition, because really the software delivery ecosystem of the United States is, in my opinion, critical infrastructure, right? That software supply chain is absolutely crucial, and that's why we see these focuses coming out of the White House, which is amazing. But the actual ability to go and put it into practice and then no doubt validate that it's actually happening, I think is going to be a hard challenge to overcome.
I mean, I think we've seen indications from other government agencies, other departments that they want to follow. They all want the promise of CMMC. Everybody, I think, kind of universally looks around and says, yes, we want verifiable control over the extended supply chain to be able to say, I know if I'm coming to Invictus absolutely follows the practices are going to mean that my DoD CUI is going to be secure in their hands, working with them as a business partner, for sure. I think that's something other departments have openly said in public. They want to see where CMMC goes. They want to see what the lessons learned are, and they want to see how they can apply it within their own environments. But I do think it's going to be an incredibly long process to be able to get to each one of those departments and agencies needing to identify, again, what is their risk posture and what is their approach. How are they going to work with CISA, who's responsible for the federal civilian executive branch, oversight, .gov wide, and also how are they going to work with the FAR Council. Going into the FAR Council and going into the management side of OMB and publishing those draft rule updates. That is not a short process by any stretch of the imagination. There's lots of paperwork required. Just a concurrent clearance process inside a government will make sure that that's going to be a long time coming. But yeah, I think, yes, to answer your question, I think from all the people that we've talked to and all the people that we work with, and more than just DoD, there's a desire across the board in government to get that greater fidelity around the security posture of the extended supply chain.
Well, thank you all so very much. Let's give them a round of applause.
All right, we're going to take another 30-minute break here. It's a West Virginia break, so pepper and rolls. Actually, Scott. Oh, yes. Yes. And then the next panel will be at 2:30, which is Office of Small Business and Acquisition panel. So if you're looking for contracts, you might want to stick around.